Emily and her husband Daniel had always dreamt of living in a historic home. When they found Ridgewood Manor, an old Victorian house nestled in a small town, they knew it was perfect. The towering oak trees, the wraparound porch, and the vintage charm captivated them. The price was surprisingly low, but they brushed off any concerns, eager to start their new life. On the day they moved in, a strange feeling settled over Emily. The air felt thick, and the house, though beautiful, seemed to watch her. As they unpacked, Emily found an old diary hidden in a secret compartment of a dresser. The cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Intrigued, she began to read. The entries were from a woman named Lillian, who had lived in the manor over a century ago. Lillian wrote about her husband, a cruel man who kept her locked away in the house. The more Emily read, the more she felt a connection to Lillian, but the final entry was chilling. Lillian wrote, "He won't let me leave. I hear whispers in the walls. I fear this house will be my tomb." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She heard creaking noises, like footsteps in the hallway. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of a woman in a white gown, standing at the foot of her bed, whispering, "Help me." The following day, Emily couldn't shake off the eerie dream. The house, which had seemed so welcoming at first, now felt oppressive. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow, and the air was thick with an unspoken tension. Daniel, however, dismissed her fears, attributing them to the stress of the move. Emily decided to delve deeper into the history of Ridgewood Manor. She visited the town's library and unearthed old newspaper articles about the house. What she found was unsettling. Lillian's husband, George Ridgewood, had been a well-known figure in the town, a man of wealth and power, but with a dark reputation. Rumors of his violent temper and the mysterious disappearance of his wife had swirled for years. The townsfolk believed that Lillian had been driven mad by her husband's cruelty and had eventually vanished without a trace. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, she noticed something odd. The old mirror in their bedroom, a relic left behind by the previous owners, seemed to distort her reflection. Her image was pale, gaunt, and behind her, a shadow loomed. She blinked, and the reflection returned to normal, but the unease lingered. In the dead of night, Emily was jolted awake by the sound of sobbing. It was faint, almost as if it were coming from the walls. She nudged Daniel, but he was fast asleep. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, until it abruptly stopped. Emily lay there, heart pounding, too terrified to move. Emily's nights were now filled with restless sleep and disturbing dreams. The woman in the white gown appeared frequently, always whispering the same words, "Help me." Determined to find answers, Emily returned to the diary. She noticed that the entries became increasingly erratic, as if Lillian's sanity was slipping away. Lillian wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. One entry stood out. "I found the room today, the one he told me never to enter. It was filled with relics, objects of dark power. I fear he's done something terrible." The entry was dated just days before Lillian's disappearance. Emily's curiosity was piqued. She searched the house looking for any hidden rooms. In the basement, behind a stack of old crates, she found a door. It was small and nondescript, but when she opened it, a foul stench hit her. The room was dark, filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, different from the one in her bedroom. This mirror seemed ancient, with a frame carved with strange symbols. As Emily approached it, she felt a cold breeze, though the air in the basement was still. She looked into the mirror, and her reflection stared back, but something was wrong. The reflection's eyes were hollow, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. Emily stumbled back, a sense of overwhelming terror gripping her. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and as she backed away, she heard a faint whisper, "He's here." Emily was now convinced that something malevolent was in the house. The mirror in the hidden room seemed to be the source. She tried to tell Daniel, but he brushed it off as paranoia. Emily knew she needed help, so she contacted a local historian who specialized in the paranormal. The historian, a woman named Mrs. Whitfield, was intrigued by Emily's story. She visited the manor the next day, bringing with her old books and tools for detecting spiritual activity. As soon as she stepped into the house, Mrs. Whitfield's expression grew grave. "This place is heavy with darkness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They went to the basement, and as soon as Mrs. Whitfield saw the mirror, She gasped. "This is no ordinary mirror," she said. "It's a portal, a gateway for spirits. Whoever used this was dabbling in dark magic." Mrs. Whitfield began a ritual to cleanse the house, but as she chanted, the air grew colder, and the lights flickered. Suddenly, the mirror in the basement cracked, and a shadowy figure emerged. It was George Ridgewood, his eyes burning with malevolence. The figure lunged at Mrs. Whitfield, knocking her to the ground. Emily screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Emily grabbed Mrs. Whitfield and dragged her upstairs away from the basement. The house seemed to come alive around them. Doors slammed shut, and the walls groaned as if they were closing in. They could hear George's footsteps following them, a slow, deliberate pace that echoed through the halls. They made it to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as Emily frantically pulled at the doorknob. Mrs. Whitfield, regaining her composure, pulled out a small vial of holy water and splashed it on the door. There was a hiss, and the door creaked open just enough for them to squeeze through. Once outside, the oppressive weight lifted, but Emily knew they weren't safe yet. Mrs. Whitfield explained that the mirror was the key. "We have to destroy it," she said. "If we don't, George's spirit will be free to haunt whoever lives here." They decided to return to the house at dawn, when the darkness would be at its weakest. Emily spent the night at a nearby motel, unable to sleep, her mind racing with fear and anticipation. At the break of dawn, Emily and Mrs. Whitfield returned to Ridgewood Manor, armed with holy water, salt, and the knowledge that this could be their last chance to rid the house of its curse. The house was eerily quiet as they entered, the oppressive atmosphere from the night before now replaced with an ominous calm. They headed straight to the basement. The mirror, though cracked, still stood in the center of the room, radiating a dark energy. Mrs. Whitfield began the ritual, circling the mirror with salt and reciting an incantation. Emily watched in tense silence, clutching a vial of holy water, ready to act. As Mrs. Whitfield's chant grew louder, the mirror began to vibrate. The shadowy figure of George Ridgewood appeared again, but this time he seemed weaker, less defined. Emily could see the rage in his eyes as he fought to escape the mirror's grasp. With a final chant, Mrs. Whitfield nodded to Emily, who threw the holy water at the mirror. The room shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and George's figure dissolved into the darkness. The house fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Emily knew that the nightmare was finally over. Ridgewood Manor, once a place of darkness and fear, was now just a house, no longer haunted by the tormented spirit of George Ridgewood. In the small town of Hollow Creek there was a legend that no one dared to speak of: the cursed forest. It was said that those who entered the forest never returned, or if they did, they were never the same. The trees were ancient, their twisted branches like the fingers of a long-dead giant reaching out to ensnare the unwary. The locals whispered that the forest was alive, cursed by an ancient evil that had taken root deep within the earth. Jack, a thrill-seeker and skeptic of all things supernatural, dismissed the stories as mere folklore. He had always been drawn to the unknown, eager to prove that there was no such thing as curses or ghosts. So, when he heard about the cursed forest, he knew he had to explore it. Despite the warnings from the townsfolk, Jack set off early one morning, armed with a flashlight, a map, and a camera. The entrance to the forest was marked by an old, crumbling stone archway, covered in moss and vines. As he crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down his spine, but he brushed it off as a chill in the air. The forest was dense, the canopy of trees blocking out most of the sunlight, casting everything in a greenish gloom. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Jack took out his camera and began to document his journey, eager to capture proof that there was nothing to fear. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the path became less defined, overgrown with brambles and thick roots. Jack's confidence began to wane as he realized that the forest seemed to be leading him in circles. No matter which direction he took, he always ended up back at the same clearing, a place where the trees seemed to close in around him. Hours passed, and the light in the forest grew dimmer. Jack was starting to feel uneasy. The forest, which had seemed so ordinary at first, now felt alive with a sinister presence. The trees, once still, now seemed to move ever so slightly, as if they were watching him. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on him like a weight. Just as he was about to turn back, Jack heard a faint whisper, It was so soft that he almost missed it, but it was there, a voice, beckoning him deeper into the forest. Against his better judgment, Jack followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush until he reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, gnarled tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. The whispering grew louder, and Jack realized it was coming from the tree itself. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he saw something glinting in the bark of the tree. It was a small silver pendant half buried in the wood. Jack reached out to touch it, and as soon as his fingers brushed the metal, a shock of cold ran up his arm. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, menacing growl that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his feet. Jack stumbled back, but it was too late. The ground around the tree began to shift, and from the roots, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She was dressed in tattered rags, and her long, dark hair hung limply around her face. "Why have you come here?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper. Jack tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The woman's eyes bore into him, filled with an ancient pain that made his blood run cold. The woman moved closer, her presence filling Jack with a sense of dread. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "This forest is cursed, and now, so are you." Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words. "Cursed? What do you mean?" The woman's gaze never left his. "This forest was once a place of beauty, but it was tainted by the blood of the innocent. Long ago, a group of settlers angered the spirits of the land. In their greed, they took what was not theirs, and in return, the land took their lives." She reached out and touched Jack's arm, and he felt a coldness seep into his bones. The curse bound their souls to this forest, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. They cannot leave, and neither can you. Jack tried to pull away, but the woman's grip was like iron. "There must be a way out," he pleaded. "I didn't mean any harm." The woman shook her head, her expression sorrowful. "There is no escape. Once the forest has you, it never lets go." The realization hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He was trapped, just like the others who had ventured into the forest before him. The woman's grip tightened, and he felt the coldness spread through his body, sapping his strength. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing taller and more menacing. "Please," Jack begged. "There must be something I can do." The woman's eyes softened, and for a moment Jack thought he saw a flicker of hope. "There is one way," she said quietly, "but it comes at a great cost." Desperation clawed at Jack as he clung to the woman's words. "I'll do anything," he said, his voice trembling. "Just tell me what I need to do." The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering to the ancient tree behind her. "The curse can be broken," she began slowly, "but it requires a sacrifice, an innocent life to take your place." Jack recoiled in horror. "You want me to kill someone?" The woman's expression was unreadable. "The curse is bound to the blood of the innocent. To break it, you must offer a life in exchange for your own. If you refuse, you will remain here, forever trapped within the forest." Jack's mind raced. The idea of taking a life repulsed him, but the thought of being trapped in the cursed forest, doomed to wander for eternity, was equally terrifying. "There has to be another way," he pleaded. The woman shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "There is no other way. The spirits demand a price, and they will not be denied." Jack felt the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. He was faced with an impossible choice: sacrifice an innocent life or lose his own. He knew he couldn't stay in the forest. The fear, the isolation, the growing madness, it was too much to bear. But to take a life, to condemn someone else to his fate, how could he live with himself? He looked at the woman, her ghostly form flickering like a dying flame. "What if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The woman's gaze hardened. "Then you will remain here like the others. Your soul will be bound to the forest, and you will never know peace." Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew he had to make a decision, but the weight of it was crushing him. The woman's words echoed in his mind. There was no other way. In the distance, Jack heard a rustling sound, and he turned to see another figure emerging from the trees. It was a young girl, no more than 10 years old, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at Jack, her expression one of confusion and terror. "No," Jack whispered, stepping back. "Not her." The woman's gaze was unyielding. "She is innocent. Her life can break the curse. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the girl. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to die." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't take an innocent life to save his own. But as he looked at the woman, he knew that there was no other choice. The forest had claimed him, and it would claim the girl too if he didn't act. With shaking hands, Jack reached for the knife at his belt. The girl's eyes widened in terror as he approached her, and she backed away, stumbling over the roots of the ancient tree. "Please don't," she begged, her voice breaking. Jack's heart shattered as he raised the knife. He didn't want to do it, but he knew he had no choice. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, urging him on. "Do it! Break the curse!" With a cry of anguish, Jack brought the knife down, and the forest seemed to shudder around him. The girl's scream pierced the air, and then there was silence. Jack fell to his knees, the knife slipping from his hand. He felt sick, his body trembling as the weight of what he had done crashed over him. The woman stepped forward, her ghostly form solidifying as the curse began to break. "You have done what was necessary," she said quietly. "The curse is lifted." As the woman spoke, the forest around them began to change. The darkness that had clung to the trees like a shroud lifted, and the oppressive atmosphere dissipated. The twisted branches straightened, and the leaves regained their vibrant green color. The air, once thick with malevolence, now felt lighter, almost peaceful. But Jack felt no peace. The girl's lifeless body lay at his feet, a stark reminder of the price he had paid. He had saved himself, but at what cost? The woman's gaze softened as she looked at him, her expression tinged with sadness. "You are free to leave," she said, "but you must carry the weight of your actions with you. The curse may be broken, but the guilt will remain." Jack stood on shaky legs, his mind numb. The forest that had seemed so terrifying now appeared almost ordinary, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same. He had made a choice, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Without another word, he turned and began to walk away, leaving the clearing behind. The woman watched him go, her form gradually fading until she was nothing more than a whisper on the wind. As Jack reached the edge of the forest, he paused, looking back one last time. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the beauty of the scene was lost on him. All he could see was the girl's face, her terrified eyes, and the blood on his hands. He stepped through the archway back into the world of the living, but he knew that he would never truly escape the forest. It would be with him always, a shadow in the corner of his mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurked within even the most ordinary places. And as he walked away, the forest stood silent, its curse lifted, but its memory lingering, waiting for the next soul to venture into its depths. Lucas had always been fascinated by the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. Willow Creek Manor was a relic of the past, its grandeur faded by years of neglect. Locals whispered about the place, telling tales of hauntings and strange occurrences, but Lucas never put much stock in such stories. To him, it was just an empty house with a lot of history. When an unexpected letter arrived in his mailbox, inviting him to spend a night at Willow Creek Manor, he couldn't resist. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect. It spoke of a large sum of money offered to anyone who could last a single night within the manor's walls. Lucas saw it as a challenge, a way to prove to himself and others that there was no such thing as ghosts. On the night of his stay, Lucas arrived at the manor just as the sun was setting. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching his every move. The front door creaked open as if it had been expecting him. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, Lucas stepped inside. The interior was even more impressive than he'd imagined. Grand chandeliers hung from the ceilings, their crystals catching the last rays of sunlight. Dust-covered furniture hinted at the house's former glory, but something about the place felt off, like the air was too thick, too still. As Lucas explored the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, and he could swear he heard whispers echoing through the empty halls. But he pushed the thoughts aside, chalking it up to his imagination running wild in the eerie setting. He found a grand bedroom upstairs with a large canopy bed and a fireplace that still had logs stacked inside. Deciding this would be his base for the night, he set up his things and settled in, determined to prove that the house was nothing more than a decaying old building. As the night wore on, the manor seemed to come alive around him. The once silent halls were now filled with strange noises, creaking floorboards, distant footsteps, and the occasional soft knock on the walls. Lucas tried to ignore it, focusing on reading a book he'd brought along. But the noises grew louder, more insistent, as if the house was trying to get his attention. Around midnight, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. Lucas shivered, feeling a cold breeze brush against his skin. He looked up from his book and saw that the bedroom door, which he had closed, was now slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness stretched from the hallway into the room, and in that darkness he saw movement. At first, it was just a shadow, barely noticeable, but then it grew, taking on a more defined shape. A figure stood just outside the door, watching him. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the apparition. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face hidden in shadow. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. Summoning all his courage, Lucas called out to the figure, "Who are you? What do you want?" His voice echoed through the room, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly and glided down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. Lucas hesitated for a moment before getting up and following her. His footsteps were loud against the creaky floorboards, but the woman made no sound as she moved. She led him through the winding corridors of the manor, down a spiral staircase and into the basement. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of mold. Lucas's breath came out in white puffs as he descended, the woman always just out of reach. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped in front of an old wooden door, half rotted from years of neglect. She turned to face him, her eyes now visible, deep, hollow voids that seemed to stare into his soul. With a trembling hand, Lucas reached out and opened the door. Behind the door was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks, and in the center of the room stood a large stone altar. On top of the altar were old, yellowed bones arranged in a grotesque display, as if part of some ancient ritual. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he was looking at. A makeshift tomb hidden away beneath the manor. The bones were human, long dead and forgotten, left to decay in the darkness. But there was something more, something that made his blood run cold. The woman stood beside the altar, her ghostly form now more defined, her face clearer. She was beautiful, but her expression was one of sorrow and anger. Lucas knew without needing to be told that these bones belonged to her. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him as the woman began to speak, not with words, but with emotions. Anger, betrayal, pain, all of it flooded into Lucas's mind. She had been murdered, her life taken in some cruel act, and her remains hidden away to cover up the crime. The manor had been her prison ever since, her spirit trapped by the unresolved injustice. Suddenly the room began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling as the walls groaned in protest. Lucas felt a force pulling him back, away from the altar, away from the woman. He stumbled, trying to resist, but it was no use. The door slammed shut, and the last thing he saw was the woman's sorrowful eyes before darkness swallowed him whole. Lucas woke up in the grand bedroom, the morning sun streaming through the windows. For a moment he thought it had all been a dream, until he noticed the dirt under his fingernails and the faint scent of decay lingering in the air. He quickly gathered his things and left the manor, the experience too fresh, too real to process. As he drove away from Willow Creek Manor, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he had been part of something much bigger than himself. The woman's story, her pain, and her need for justice haunted him. He knew he couldn't just leave it behind, not after what he had seen. Over the next few weeks, Lucas began to research the history of Willow Creek Manor. What he uncovered was a dark and twisted tale of greed, murder, and betrayal. The manor had once belonged to a wealthy family, the Bakers, who had mysteriously disappeared one night. The case had never been solved, and the manor had been left to rot, along with the secrets it held. Lucas's investigation led him to an old newspaper article from the time of the Bakers' disappearance. The article mentioned a young woman who had been involved with the family, a maid who had gone missing around the same time. Her name was Emily, and the description matched the ghostly figure Lucas had encountered. Determined to bring closure to the woman who had suffered so much, Lucas returned to the manor, this time with the authorities. Together, they uncovered the hidden basement and the remains that had been left there for decades. The discovery made headlines, and the story of Emily Baker finally came to light. With the truth revealed, Lucas hoped that Emily's spirit would finally find peace, but deep down, he knew that the horrors of Willow Creek Manor would never truly fade. The house was a place of darkness, and its history would continue to haunt those who dared to enter its doors. Tom and Sarah were no strangers to road trips. Every year they would pack up their car and set out on a new adventure, exploring the hidden corners of the country. This year they decided to take a detour off the main highways, opting instead for the back roads that wove through small towns and forgotten landscapes. Their journey took them to an old, winding road that wasn't on any of their maps. The road sign was rusted and barely legible, but it intrigued them. "Let's take this road," Sarah suggested, eager for a bit of mystery. Tom agreed, and they turned onto the path less traveled. The road was narrow and overgrown, with trees arching overhead like a tunnel. The air felt different here, thicker, almost oppressive, but the scenery was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, with the trees casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. As they drove deeper into the forest, they noticed the road signs becoming increasingly strange. The first sign read, "Turn back now." They laughed it off, thinking it was some local's idea of a joke. But the next sign was more unsettling. "You've been warned. Maybe we should turn around," Tom said, half joking. But Sarah insisted they continue. "It's probably just an old road no one uses anymore. Let's see where it goes." The further they drove, the more isolated they felt. The road twisted and turned, with no signs of civilization. The trees grew denser, blocking out the sun and casting the car in a perpetual twilight. The feeling of unease settled in their stomachs, but neither wanted to admit it. Then, they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He stood perfectly still, as if waiting for them. "What should we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Tom didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the man. After a moment, he decided to roll down the window and call out, "Do you need help?" The man slowly lifted his head, revealing a face that was pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare right through them. He didn't respond, just kept staring. Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. Something about the man was deeply unsettling, like he didn't belong in this world. "We should go," Tom said, his voice low. But before he could put the car in reverse, the man finally spoke. "The road ends here," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "There's no turning back." With those words, the man stepped off the road and vanished into the trees. Tom and Sarah exchanged a glance, both feeling a surge of panic. Without saying another word, Tom hit the gas, speeding down the road, desperate to leave the stranger behind. But the road didn't seem to end. No matter how far they drove, it just kept going, winding deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer, the shadows longer, and the feeling of dread heavier. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the road became even more sinister. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches clawing at the car like bony fingers. They passed another sign, this one covered in vines. Sarah leaned out the window to read it, her voice shaking. "It says no escape." Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, driving on an endless road with no way out. The forest was a maze, and they were caught in its web. Tom tried turning the car around, but no matter which direction they went, the road just kept stretching on and on. The night wore on, the hours blending together as they drove in circles. Exhaustion took its toll, but they couldn't stop. Something was chasing them, lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. They could feel it, a presence watching, waiting. Then, out of the darkness, the figure appeared again. The man stood in the middle of the road just as before. This time they didn't stop. Tom swerved to avoid him, but as they passed, the man's face turned towards them, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They sped past, hearts racing, but the man's voice echoed in their minds. "The road ends here. You've come too far." Sarah looked in the rearview mirror and gasped. The man was gone, but something else had taken his place. A shadowy figure, tall and menacing, was chasing them, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "Drive faster!" Sarah screamed, but it was no use. The car's engine roared, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The shadow was gaining on them, its presence suffocating, like a blanket of darkness wrapping around them. Then, the road began to change. The trees parted, revealing a clearing up ahead. But it wasn't salvation. It was a dead end. The road stopped abruptly at the edge of a cliff, with nothing but a void beyond. Tom slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the edge. They sat there, breathing heavily, the silence deafening. The shadowy figure was gone, but the feeling of dread remained. They got out of the car and approached the cliff, looking down into the abyss. There was nothing there, just darkness stretching out endlessly. Tom and Sarah realized then that they had been lured here, trapped on this forgotten highway by forces beyond their understanding. As they stood at the edge, the ground beneath them began to crumble. They tried to back away, but it was too late. The cliff gave way, and they fell into the void, their screams echoing in the darkness. The next morning, the highway patrol found their car abandoned at the edge of the forest. There was no sign of Tom or Sarah, and the road they had taken didn't exist on any map. The patrol officer shook his head, marking it as another unsolved mystery of the forgotten highway. And so, the road remained, hidden, waiting, ready to claim its next victims.